Hello, welcome to this tutorial. In the previous video, we learned about different types of scope in JavaScript, and today we'll be learning lexical scope and closures in JavaScript. So let's at first have a look at the definition of lexical scope. We say that lexical scope means that if functions access to variables is determined by the place where the function is defined, not by where it is executed or called. And it depends on where the code is written. So the term lexical means that something that is related to structure or position. This will make more sense when I do a coding example. Let's say in the global scope, I have a variable called name and its value is, let's say, David. And inside of global scope, I have a function called f1 that inside of which I put a console.log statement and that logs the value of name variable. And then I declare another function inside of this global scope called f2. And this function redeclares this name variable with a different value, let's say then. And then we call the function f1 inside of this function f2. And then let me do something like I call this f2 function. What do you think will happen when I call this f2 function? Let's have a look at the statements that we have inside of this f2 function. The first statement declares a variable name initialized with the value zen, and then we call the function f1 inside of it. And when the execution moves to the function f1, this function f1 has a console.log statement that logs the value of name. But we have two variables declared as name that have two different values. But what do you think will be logged into the console as the value of name variable when I call this f2 function? Let's try to run this program. Node index.js. You might have guessed it that it will print Zen because this f1 is being called in f2, so the value of the name variable should be get from this f2 function. But this is not how JavaScript decides how the value of a variable is accessed. JavaScript uses a concept that we call as scope chaining. What do we mean by scope chaining? JavaScript always looks in the current scope first, then moves outward step by step. Let's try to understand this. When our execution reached at this f1 function, JavaScript saw this statement console.log and it has to log the value of name variable inside the console. At first, JavaScript looks for the value of this name variable inside of this f1 function scope. But if it cannot find it here, what will it do? At first, it checks the current scope. So it did check the current scope. It looked into the f1 function, but it could not find the value of name variable inside of that. So what does it do after that? It moves to outer scope. It moves one step outward. So what if we move one step outward? Which scope we have one step outward? That is the global scope. So it will go one step outward, and in the global scope it finds the value of the variable name that is David, and then it logs the value to the console as our output. But you might have misunderstood as that because we are executing or calling this f1 function in the scope of f2 function, this might the name variable might take the value from this f2 function, but this is not how JavaScript works. It looks for the values for a variable from the current scope first, and then it moves one step outwards. It keeps looking outwards until it reaches the global scope. It doesn't work like the outside environment can look into the things into the inner functions. This would make more sense if I do it with the help of an example. Let's say I have a function called test scope, and inside of this function I have another function called inner, and this inner function has a variable called y equals, let's say, y equals 12. And what if I call this inner function here and I try to log the console.log the value of y variable, and then I call this function called test scope. What do you think will happen? Node index.js, and it causes a reference error saying that y is not defined here. I've already told that the outer function cannot look into the values of the inner functions, but the inner function can take values from the outer function. Let's say if I do something like, let me put this variable declaration in the outer function, and I put this log statement inside of this inner function. What do you think will happen when I run this test scope function? Will it able to log the value of y to the console or not? Let's see. Mode index.js, and it is able to access the value of y that is not inside of this function's scope. And this is something what we call as closures. A closure is a function that remembers variables from the place where it was declared. This inner function remembers variables from the environment where it is declared. It is declared inside of the function test scope, so it remembers the values of the variables that are inside of this test scope function and are not declared inside of this inner function. Let's have a look at some of the theory concepts of closures. So closures explain this behavior of lexical scope that we've just looked at. A closure keeps variables alive even after their original scope is gone. What we can conclude from here, when this outer function executes, normally it should happen that its variables should be destroyed after execution. But when this function executes, it has another function called inner inside of it. When this function is called, it is it 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 JavaScript then knows that this inner function needs the value of the variable that is in the outer scope. So JavaScript doesn't destroy this variable because this inner function needs this. So a closure is a function that remembers variables from where it was created, even after that scope has finished execution. When a function is created, it keeps a reference. This reference points to its outer scope. This connection stays even after execution. So this inner function, when it was declared, it had a reference to this outer function, and it keeps track, it has a reference to all of the data that is inside of this outer function. So this was all about lexical scope and closures.